Greetings, mammals, and welcome back to the 10,000 Heroes Show. I'm your host, Ankur Shah Delight. This show is about being the species we want to see in the world. So we explore what you, me, and 9,998 of our friends can do to make progress on personal enlightenment, world peace, and everything in between. As part of our journey towards understanding what brings us together and what keeps us apart, today I want to share 3 examples of social dialogue I learned about in the past couple of weeks. This is part of my study of civic engineering, how to prevent a civil war, mediation, that general track. So I'm going to resist the temptation to draw conclusions right now, but just want to let us all have the chance to ruminate together in these 3 examples. The first is from Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, which I'm currently reading. The second is a description of traditional dispute resolution in pre-partition Punjab from a recent interview I did with Somia Sadiq. So if you heard that episode, you will have heard this part. It's a 2-minute clip. I think it's really worth repeating. And the third is from a listener who called me yesterday and shared his experiences in facilitation and in building long-term relationships to resolve and prevent conflict. And he worked with a gentleman named Bob Chadwick. So I'll share a little bit of what I learned in the call and then read a passage from Chadwick that I found pretty inspiring online. So, I don't actually know how you see yourself in this moment, but I see you as someone like me who is interested in and capable of preventing a civil war. Someone whose actions or inactions will have a lot of consequences where you live, not just this year or this election cycle, but for the next generation and the next phase in our social development. So with that in mind, here we go. So I'm going to read a passage from Mandela's autobiography, and this is from the beginning of the book. So it's his boyhood. He grows up in the countryside in rural, what is then South Africa. And he's in this, he's part of this apartheid system, this kind of white colonial domination. But he really doesn't know much about that yet. He doesn't understand. In some ways, he doesn't even feel oppressed. He's just so rural and provincial and away from all of that. And the main influence in his life is this character called the Regent, who's his substitute father. He was sent to live with this guy, the Regent, when his own father died. And the Regent seems just like an amazing person, raised Mandela just as he raised his own children, kind of owed a favor or had a debt of gratitude to Mandela's father. And this Regent is the local traditional king. So he has some sort of complicated relationship with the colonial authorities, but still has a lot of power where he is. And so this whole passage is about dispute resolution as done by the Regent, and by assumption or by extension on my part, kind of how dispute resolution was often traditionally done in that part of the world. So here we go, Mandela. My later notions of leadership were profoundly influenced by observing the Regent and his court. I watched and learned from the tribal meetings that were regularly held at his court. These were not scheduled, but were called as needed, and were held to discuss national matters such as drought, the culling of cattle, policies ordered by a magistrate, or new laws decreed by the government. All Tembus were free to come, and a great many did, on horseback or by foot. On these occasions, the Regent was surrounded by his counselors, who functioned as the Regent's parliament and judiciary. There were wise men who retained the knowledge of tribal history and custom in their heads, and whose opinions carried great weight. Letters advising these chiefs and headmen of a meeting were dispatched from the Regent, and soon the palace became alive with important visitors and travelers from all over Tembu land. The guests would gather in the courtyard in front of the Regent's house, and he would open the meeting by thanking everyone for coming and explaining why he had summoned them. From that point on, he would not utter another word until the meeting was nearing its end. Everyone who wanted to speak did so. It was democracy in its purest form. There may have been a hierarchy of importance among the speakers, but everyone was heard, chief and subject, warrior and medicine man, shopkeeper and farmer, landowner and laborer. People spoke without interruption, and the meetings lasted for many hours. The foundation of self-government was that all men were free to voice their opinions and equal in their value as citizens. And then he notes in parentheses, women, I'm afraid, were deemed some second-class citizens. end parenthesis. At first, I was astonished by the vehemence and candor with which people criticized the regent. He was not above criticism. In fact, he was often the principal target of it. But no matter how flagrant the charge, the regent simply listened, not defending himself, showing no emotion at all. The meetings would continue until some kind of consensus was reached. They ended in unanimity or not at all. Unanimity, however, might be an agreement to disagree, to wait for a more propitious time to propose a solution. Democracy meant that all men were to be heard, and a decision was taken together as a people. Majority rule was a foreign notion. A minority was not to be crushed by a majority. Only at the end of the meeting, as the sun was setting, would the regent speak. His purpose was to sum up what had been said and form some consensus among the diverse opinions. But no conclusion was forced on people who disagreed. If no agreement could be reached, another meeting would be held. And at the very end of the council, a praise singer or poet would deliver a panegyric to the ancient kings and a mixture of compliments to and satire on the present chiefs. The audience, led by the regent, would roar with laughter. As a leader, I have always followed the principles I first saw demonstrated by the regent at the Great Palace. I have always endeavored to listen to what each and every person in a discussion had to say before venturing my own opinion. Oftentimes, my own opinion will simply represent a consensus of what I heard in the discussion. I always remember the regent's axiom. A leader, he said, is like a shepherd. He stays behind the flock, letting the most nimble go out ahead, whereupon the others follow, not realizing that all along they are being directed from behind. Okay, that was the part on Mandela. The second part is the bit with Somia. So in this excerpt from the interview, we were talking about apologies. And so this is in the context of what makes a good apology. And so she'll sum that up at the end. But and the cultural context is this is pre-partition India in the region of Punjab, which is where her grandparents acted as mediators of a sort. So she will tell the rest of the story now.
My elders were these very, like, for lack of a better term, mediators, if you will, in community. So they were folks who were really well respected. These are individuals who anyone having a conflict about anything would come to for guidance and for understanding, help us resolve this conflict. And it was a very organic process that evolved sometimes over days. So people would just come to the family house. Everybody would set up shop in the courtyard. Their charpais will be on the rooftop, and they would stay for as long as they needed to while people were talking about what had transpired. How Miaji, my great-grandfather, would, and this is one particular conflict that comes to mind, how he would navigate that is, so he would have folks on who had been wronged. And in this case, I think it was about a water buffalo that had been stolen. So there's people who are owners of the water buffalo. And then on the other side, the folks who had been accused of stealing. And then there were a bunch of other community members who participated in the process. They had just made the trek to be a part of it, probably some out of curiosity, some because they had been impacted in some way, right? So and this happened over 4 days. The process was asking, how have you been wronged? And then everybody would chime in. And then, how has this impacted you? Everybody would chime in, including those who were accused of stealing. Like, how has this conflict impacted you? And then, what should the repercussions be? What are the consequences of this? Great, everybody chimes in. Now let's hear about the impact of that consequence. So if there's a punishment, how is that going to impact everybody? And a lot of the times, just that question would reduce the punishment, if you will. Because it would foster empathy, cohesion building in community, and so many other things. And all of this happened over days. Lots of random stories about all sorts of things would emerge. People would still eat together. have chai together. Like there was lots of community cohesion that would happen in the process of trying to find a resolution to a conflict. So the apology then, to bring it back to apology, is the apology is in the opportunity to hear about how this has impacted you and how it's impacted the person and what it means to you. So like apology on steroids, really Cadillac version of apology when you do a process properly and do it right.
Okay, and our third exhibit today, the third story I want to tell, is from this friend, Stuart, who is a listener of the podcast and called and shared some of his experiences with me. And I'm so delighted that he did. So thank you, Stuart. And it's really a contribution. You know, he called in service and a desire to help this project move forward. And I'm very grateful for it. And so what he shared was all this experience he's had doing a certain kind of facilitation, a certain methodology. And he shared a lot about the motivations for it and the process of how it worked. And what I want to highlight today for you, in addition to this passage that I'm about to read, is the conclusion or the theme that Stuart shared, that it's really all about slowing the people down. And this is a theme that's come up in recent talks I've had in solo casts, but we're often trying to solve problems and we don't have the relational infrastructure that makes solving those problems make any sense. We're just really out ahead of our, what is the phrase? Ahead of our noses or over our toes or something. So in this facilitation that Stuart does, he's like, 3 days is the minimum. It's just not going to work in the same way if you don't give people 3 days. And of course, if you propose this, no one is going to want to do 3 days. And me, and this is actually very true for me, am deathly afraid of suggesting anything longer than 3 hours because I just think it's impractical and no one's going to come. And so he's just like, yeah, that's true. And the people who do come for your short ass facilitations are not going to be ready to do the real work because they haven't committed to the long-term thing, which, and here I am drawing the conclusions I said I wasn't going to do. But in the two previous examples, they're all multi-day events. They're both multi-day events. So anyhow, 3 days, slowing down, and the other ways of slowing down he proposed and has used is, he calls them grounding questions. So they're questions that really help people slow down and understand why they're personally there. Beyond the obvious of, oh, I saw this advertisement in the paper, or, you know, he's done this in many different contexts where there's lots of easy excuses like, oh, this meeting was on my calendar. But to really get people beyond that, give them so little direction that they have to find the direction themselves and actually understand in that moment, have an epiphanic moment of why they're actually there. It's the grounding questions. And then the third thing I wanted to highlight from our talk is asking a question about what could possibly go wrong. Like, what's the worst that could happen by attending this meeting? And what's the best that could happen? And the idea with this, once again, slowing people down, is that we all walk around with all these fears of what might happen. And these fears are affecting our body, they're affecting how we think, affecting our nervous system, they're affecting the decisions we make and what we say and what we don't say. And this allows people to get those fears out in the open so they're aware of it and everyone else is aware of it. And it immediately transforms the whole energy of the situation. So key message from Stuart, thank you, Stuart, is it's all about slowing down, and that whatever we try and do in this whole civic engineering world, it's not going to work unless people find a way to slow down. So with that as a preface, I'd like to read a passage written by Bob Chadwick, who is the person that Stuart learned this facilitation style with. And it's on a slightly different topic. It's adjacent, and it's about detachment, authority, and autonomy. People in positions of authority have been taught, in word and deed, to take responsibility for the actions of those in their care. The power figure is often seen looming over the shoulders of those provided a task to do. They are there, of course, to provide guidance, to answer questions, to immediately correct any deviation from the direction. This is known as management control. It is based on the subtle and never expressed belief that those given directions, like children, must be guided by the parent figure. This approach has some validity in some circumstances, like learning a new process with people entirely new to a situation. It is limiting in its effect on the participants and its impact on time in other situations. As soon as the participants sense they are dependent on the power figure, they will begin to determine what they need to do to get approval. This will include asking questions to clarify what the leader said, or maybe asking how to do the task. The leader is then prone to explain and then over-explain what is needed, using tones that indicate the listeners are children or simple-minded. Those who resent power will then challenge the leader's information or task. This will lead to a power struggle until the leader asserts her authority. All of this takes time away from accomplishing the task and focuses on the leader rather than the participants as the important persons. As the leader roams the room, looking and listening into each group, aloof yet in charge, members of the group will engage in conversation with her. Or she may enter the group and end up in a debate over the task. The net result is to shift the attention to the leader, to allow the participants to behave as children, unable to cope with the simple task. This creates codependent behavior. The participants will continuously look to the leader for signs of approval, aware of her every movement, signs of displeasure. They look for cues to determine the information they need to develop to satisfy the leader. In the consensus process, this role is changed. The leader learns to detach from the group as soon as the task is given. Detachment means leaving the circle of participants, sometimes even turning your back on them or leaving the room. This places the participants in control of doing the task. If there are questions, the participants are told to use their own judgment. If the questioner asks how to accomplish the task, they are told, "Whatever you decide to do is up to you." If the facilitator is challenged about the task, the challenger is told to do what they feel is best. This leaves the power with the person, the group. They are empowered to do the task. If the group answers a question different than the one asked, the information is accepted as part of the information base. It must be needed for the group to hear, or the question answered was better than the one asked. All right, that's what I got today in terms of conclusion. Like I said, I'm going to do my best to avoid making one. The obvious takeaway from each of these three examples is that slowness builds the community that can handle conflict. How to implement that in a culture where almost everything else is pushing in the exact opposite direction is really an open question for me, especially considering the incredible pressure I feel that if we don't do this soon, we're hosed. So, as always, I would love to hear from you. The best way to get in contact is to sign up for my newsletter and then email me a response. The easy way to do that is 10,000 heroes, all spelled out in letters, .club, 10,000heroes.club, or ankuردelight.com. Both of those should have a newsletter sign up. Or you can find me as Ankur Shah Delight on LinkedIn and take it from there. I thank you for your time, your intention, and your desire to do something constructive. And remember, as you go out into that world, we are neither perfect nor alone.